Get out of the way. Move. Now." The words didn't slip out quietly. They exploded across the marble courthouse steps like a command from someone who believed his badge gave him the right to treat people like obstacles. Officer Brad Coleman, 42 years old, 15 years on the force, stood at the top of the courthouse stairs with his chest puffed out and his hand resting on his belt like he owned the building. He wasn't speaking to a criminal. He wasn't addressing a threat. He was talking to a black woman in a navy blue suit who was simply trying to enter the same courthouse he was, at the same time, through the same public entrance that belonged to everyone. What he didn't know was that in exactly 12 minutes, this woman would walk into the police department 3 blocks away and become his new boss, his direct supervisor, his police chief. And in 18 minutes, she would have the authority to end his career with a single phone call. Zara Mitchell walked up the stone steps of the Riverside County Courthouse in downtown Phoenix, Arizona. Her black leather briefcase swung gently at her side. Her navy suit was pressed, professional, understated. Her natural hair was pulled back in a low bun. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned every step she took. Behind her, about 20 feet back, Elena Ramon, a court reporter, hurried to catch up, juggling her equipment bag and a large coffee. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse plaza. It was 9:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, and the steps buzzed with the usual mix of attorneys, plaintiffs, defendants, and courthouse staff heading inside for morning sessions. Zara had been in Phoenix for exactly 18 hours. She'd flown in from Detroit the night before, checked into a modest hotel downtown, and spent the evening reviewing personnel files for the police department she would officially take over in less than 3 hours. She'd read about Officer Brad Coleman. She'd seen his disciplinary record. She'd noted the complaints. She'd studied the pattern. But she hadn't met him face to face. That was about to change. As Zara approached the main entrance, a cluster of uniformed officers stood near the security checkpoint inside. They were there for a hearing, testimony in a case involving police conduct. Officer Coleman stood among them, but unlike his colleagues, who were engaged in quiet conversation, he was scanning the crowd outside through the glass doors like a sentry looking for trouble. His eyes landed on Zara as she climbed the steps. Elena Ramon, still trailing behind, later told reporters what she witnessed next. She saw Officer Coleman's expression shift the moment he spotted Zara. His jaw tightened, his posture straightened. He said something to the officer next to him, something Elena couldn't hear from her position, but she saw the way the other officer glanced outside and shrugged. Coleman pushed through the glass doors and stepped onto the courthouse steps. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice carrying the tone of someone stopping a suspect. "Ma'am, you need to use the side entrance." Zara paused, 1 foot on the step above, and turned to face him. Her expression was neutral, patient, but her eyes were sharp. "This is the main entrance," she said evenly. "It's open to the public." Coleman descended 2 steps, closing the distance between them. "The side entrance is for visitors. This entrance is for official business." Around them, other people continued climbing the steps, walking right past Coleman and through the main doors without being stopped. A white woman in a business suit, an elderly white man with a cane, a young Hispanic lawyer carrying case files. None of them were directed to any side entrance. Elena Ramon had reached the bottom of the steps by now, close enough to hear every word. She pulled out her phone, not to film at first, but to check the time. She had court reporting duties starting in 10 minutes. Zara looked at Coleman's badge, then met his eyes again. "I have official business here today," she said. "This is the appropriate entrance for me to use." That's when Coleman's mask slipped completely. "Lady," he said, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that still carried to the people around them. "I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but you don't look like someone who has official business in this courthouse. Use the side door like you're supposed to." The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a fire that had just been lit. Elena Ramon looked up from her phone, fully alert now to what was happening in front of her. She saw Zara's face, still composed but with something harder now behind her eyes. She saw Coleman, chest out, chin raised, like he was daring someone to challenge his authority. And she saw the other people on the steps beginning to notice, beginning to slow down, beginning to realize they were witnessing something that went beyond a simple misunderstanding. Robert Hayes, a defense attorney who had been climbing the steps behind Zara, stopped completely. Lisa Casper, a prosecutor heading into the building, paused at the doors and turned around. David Park, another prosecutor, was just arriving and caught the tail end of Coleman's statement. Zara didn't raise her voice. She didn't step backward. She didn't show fear or anger or confusion. Instead, she reached into her briefcase, pulled out a folder, and opened it calmly. "Officer Coleman," she said, reading from the top page. "Badge number 7394, 15 years with the Phoenix Police Department, currently assigned to Downtown Patrol Division." Coleman's expression shifted from confidence to suspicion to something approaching alarm. "How do you know that?" "Because I make it my business to know the officers I work with," Zara replied, closing the folder and slipping it back into her briefcase. "And as of 11 a.m. today, I work with all of them." The courthouse steps had gone quieter now. Elena Ramond found herself holding her breath, phone now forgotten in her hand. Robert Hayes moved closer, positioning himself where he could hear everything clearly. Lisa Casper pulled out her own phone, not yet filming, but ready. Coleman's voice got louder, more aggressive. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but I'm ordering you to move to the side entrance right now. And if I refuse? Then you'll be arrested for failure to comply with a lawful order." That's when David Park stepped forward. "Excuse me, officer," he said, his voice calm but carrying the authority of someone who spent his days in courtrooms. "I'm ADA David Park with the county prosecutor's office. Could you explain what law requires this woman to use a different entrance than everyone else?" Coleman turned toward Park, irritated at the interruption. "This is police business. Stay out of it." "Actually," Park replied, "this is taking place on public property at a public building, which makes it everyone's business. And I'm not seeing any posted signs directing anyone to alternative entrances based on any criteria." Elena Ramond later said this was the moment she knew she had to start recording. She opened her camera app and began filming, holding the phone low, trying to be unobtrusive. Around the steps, more people had stopped to watch. An elderly black man in a cardigan heading to traffic court. A young white woman with an internship badge from the public defender's office. A Hispanic family, probably there for immigration hearings. Coleman's face was flushed red now. "Ma'am," he said to Zara, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Final warning. Move to the side entrance or you will be placed under arrest." Zara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said something that no one expected. "Officer Coleman, before you make that decision, let me ask you this. Do you enjoy your job?" Coleman blinked, thrown off by the question. "What? Do you enjoy being a police officer? Do you find it fulfilling? Are you proud of the work you do?" What kind of question is that? The kind of question your new police chief might ask before deciding whether you're fit to continue wearing that badge. The words hit the courthouse steps like lightning hitting a tree. Coleman stared at her, his mouth slightly open, processing what she had just said. Robert Hayes whispered to Lisa Casper, "Did she just say what I think she said?" Elena Ramond zoomed in slightly with her phone camera, catching the exact moment Coleman's expression changed from confusion to recognition to something that might have been panic. "You're lying," he said, but his voice cracked slightly on the words. Zara reached into her briefcase again and pulled out a different folder. This one was thicker, official-looking, with the seal of the Phoenix Police Department visible on the cover. "Chief Zara Mitchell," she said, opening it to reveal a photograph and identification card. "Effective 11 a.m. today. And Officer Coleman, you've just given me a very clear picture of how you conduct yourself when you think no one important is watching." The silence that followed was so complete that Elena Ramond later said she could hear traffic from 3 blocks away. Coleman's face went through a series of changes, red to white to gray. His hand, which had been resting confidently on his belt, dropped to his side. His shoulders, which had been squared and aggressive, began to sag. "Chief Mitchell," he stammered. I was just..." You were just what, Officer Coleman? The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to drop. Around them, phones were coming out now. The young intern from the public defender's office was filming. Robert Hayes was taking notes on his phone. David Park stood with his arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with the expression of a prosecutor who had just seen a case make itself. Coleman looked around at all the faces watching him, all the phones pointed in his direction, all the witnesses to his humiliation. "Chief, I apologize, I didn't know who you were." "And that," Zara said, her voice carrying clearly across the courthouse steps, "is exactly the problem." She took a step closer to him, close enough that her next words were meant primarily for his ears, though everyone could still hear them. "Officer Coleman, in the 15 minutes I've been in this city in my official capacity, you have profiled me based on my race, attempted to deny me access to a public building, threatened me with arrest for exercising my legal rights, and shown me exactly why this police department needs new leadership." Coleman opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. "The thing is," Zara continued, "I wasn't here in my capacity as police chief. I was here as a citizen with business in this courthouse, just like any other citizen. But you decided I didn't belong based on how I look." "I made a mistake," Coleman said weakly. "No, Officer Coleman, you made a choice, and now I have to make one." She pulled out her phone and dialed a number. The call connected immediately. "Captain Morrison, this is Chief Mitchell. I need you to send a supervisor to the courthouse steps immediately. I have an officer here who needs to be relieved of duty pending a disciplinary hearing." Elena Raymond captured the exact moment Coleman realized his career was ending. His face went completely white. His hands began to shake. He looked around at all the people watching him as if searching for somewhere to hide. "Chief, please," he said. "I have a family. I've been on the force for 15 years. Zara ended her call and looked at him directly. "Officer Coleman, how many citizens do you think you've treated this way over those 15 years? How many people did you humiliate who didn't have the power to hold you accountable?" The questions hit him like physical blows. And then, just to make sure everyone understood what had transpired, Zara turned to address the crowd that had gathered. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the courthouse steps. "My name is Zara Mitchell, and I am the new police chief for the Phoenix Police Department. What you just witnessed is exactly the kind of behavior that will no longer be tolerated under my leadership." A few people began to clap. Then more joined in. Soon the applause echoed off the courthouse walls. Robert Hayes approached her. "Chief Mitchell, I'm Robert Hayes, defense attorney. Would you be willing to provide a statement about what just occurred here?" "Absolutely," Zara replied. "And I want everyone who witnessed this to know that if you've experienced similar treatment from any officer in this department, I want to hear about it." Elena Raymond stopped filming and approached as well. "Chief, I'm Elena Raymond, court reporter. I recorded the entire incident. Would you like me to provide you with a copy?" "Yes, please, and thank you for documenting the truth." Coleman stood frozen as activity swirled around him. Within minutes, Captain Frank Morrison arrived with 2 supervisors. Coleman was escorted away, his badge and weapon confiscated on the spot. As the crowd began to disperse, Zara climbed the remaining courthouse steps. She had business to complete before officially taking over the police department. But everyone who had witnessed the incident knew they had just seen something unprecedented. A police officer's career had ended not in a back room or a private meeting, but in full public view as a direct consequence of his own actions and prejudices. David Park caught up with Zara at the courthouse entrance. "Chief Mitchell," he said, "the prosecutor's office looks forward to working with you." Zara smiled. "The feeling is mutual, Ada Park, and I think you'll find that accountability flows in both directions under my leadership." As she disappeared into the courthouse, Elena Raymond looked at the video on her phone. 12 minutes of footage that captured not just one officer's downfall, but the beginning of what promised to be a very different kind of police leadership in Phoenix. She uploaded it with a simple caption: "New police chief handles racist officer on courthouse steps. Real accountability in real time." Within an hour, it had been shared 1,000 times. But the real story was just beginning. 23 years earlier, Zara Mitchell was 8 years old, sitting in the back seat of her mother's Honda Civic on a sweltering summer afternoon in Detroit. Her mother, Diane Mitchell, had been pulled over for allegedly running a red light at an intersection where the traffic signal had been broken for 3 days. Everyone in the neighborhood knew it was broken. The city knew it was broken. But Officer Danny Kruger either didn't know or didn't care. Zara watched through the rear window as her mother, a nurse who had just finished a 12-hour shift at Detroit General Hospital, stood beside the car with her hands visible, her voice respectful, explaining that the light wasn't functioning. Officer Kruger's response was to place her in handcuffs, search the vehicle, and lecture her about making excuses for breaking the law. The traffic stop lasted 45 minutes. Her mother received 3 tickets: failure to stop at a red light, improper lane usage, driving with a defective tail light that wasn't actually defective. Total fines, $847. That night, 8-year-old Zara asked her mother why the police officer was so mean to her when she hadn't done anything wrong. Her mother sat on the edge of Zara's bed and said something she would never forget. "Baby, some people think they have the right to treat others badly just because they have power. But power is supposed to protect people, not hurt them. And someday, if God wills it, maybe you'll be in a position to make sure power gets used the right way." At age 8, Zara decided she wanted to be a police officer. Her path wasn't straightforward. At 15, she was an honor student at Crockett Technical High School in Detroit, captain of the debate team, and president of the student council. She volunteered at a community center in her neighborhood, tutoring younger kids in math and reading. Her grades were good enough for any college she wanted to attend, but her family couldn't afford any college she wanted to attend. So Zara made a choice that would define the next decade of her life. She enlisted in the Army Military Police Corps straight out of high school, using the educational benefits to pay for college while gaining the kind of experience that would make her a better police officer later. Basic training at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri was the first time in her life that Zara was evaluated purely on her performance rather than her background, her neighborhood, or the color of her skin. She graduated second in her class. Advanced individual training at Fort Gordon in Georgia introduced her to military law enforcement. She learned about investigations, patrol procedures, evidence handling, and use of force protocols from instructors who had seen combat, worked international cases, and handled situations that made civilian policing look simple by comparison. Her first assignment was Fort Bragg in North Carolina, where she worked everything from traffic enforcement to criminal investigations to base security. But it was a specific incident during her second year that shaped her understanding of what leadership really meant. A young soldier named Private Jerome Washington had been accused of stealing equipment from the base motor pool. The evidence seemed clear. Washington had been seen in the area after hours. Some of the missing items were found in his barracks locker. His immediate supervisor, Sergeant Kevin Drake, was pushing for a court-martial. But something about the case bothered Zara. Washington had no history of disciplinary problems. He was scheduled to deploy in 3 months. He had a wife and 2-year-old daughter back home in Alabama. Why would he risk everything to steal motor pool equipment he had no use for? So Zara dug deeper. She spent weeks reviewing security footage, interviewing witnesses, tracking down leads that other investigators had dismissed. What she discovered was that Sergeant Drake, Washington's supervisor, had been stealing equipment for months and selling it off base. When he realized he was about to be caught, he planted evidence in Washington's locker and constructed a case against him. Zara's investigation not only cleared Private Washington, but resulted in Drake's court-martial and dishonorable discharge. More importantly, it taught her that the truth doesn't always surface easily, especially when someone in authority has an interest in keeping it buried. After 4 years in the military police, Zara left the Army as a sergeant with commendations for investigation work, leadership, and integrity. She used her GI Bill benefits to attend Wayne State University in Detroit, where she majored in criminal justice and minored in psychology. College was where Zara first encountered the academic side of policing. She studied constitutional law, community relations, crisis intervention, and police administration. But more than that, she studied the history of policing in America, particularly the complicated relationship between law enforcement and communities of color. She wrote her senior thesis on community-oriented policing as a tool for building trust in underserved neighborhoods. The paper earned her the Dean's Award for Academic Excellence and caught the attention of Professor Elizabeth Hartwell, a former FBI agent who had transitioned into academia. Professor Hartwell became Zara's mentor and helped her understand that good policing wasn't just about catching criminals. It was about building relationships, preventing crime, and serving the community in ways that went far beyond arrests and citations. Upon graduation, Zara was recruited by several police departments. Chicago offered her a competitive starting salary and fast track to detective. Los Angeles promised specialized training and assignment to a high-profile unit. Miami offered immediate placement in their community policing initiative. But Zara chose to return home to Detroit. She started as a patrol officer in the 5th Precinct, covering some of the same neighborhoods where she had grown up. Her first training officer was Sergeant Louise Barnes, a 20-year veteran who had seen the city change, the department evolve, and young officers come and go. Sergeant Barnes was skeptical of Zara at first. Military background, college degree, idealistic about community policing, she seemed like another rookie who would either get disillusioned and quit or get promoted to a desk job where she wouldn't have to deal with the street anymore. But Zara proved her wrong. During her first year, Zara made arrests when necessary, wrote reports when required, and followed procedures as trained. But she also did things that surprised her colleagues. She learned the names of the kids who hung out on her beat. She knew which elderly residents lived alone and might need assistance. She understood which local businesses were struggling and which were thriving. When Mrs. Dorothy Fleming's apartment was burglarized, most officers would have taken a report, dusted for prints, and moved on to the next call. Zara did all of that, but she also helped Mrs. Fleming contact victim services, drove her to the social services office to apply for assistance, and followed up weekly to make sure she was getting the support she needed. When teenager Marcus Robinson was caught tagging a building with graffiti, the standard procedure was arrest, booking, and letting the courts sort it out. Instead, Zara talked to Marcus, found out he was an aspiring artist with nowhere to legally practice his craft, and connected him with a community center that had a legal graffiti wall and offered art classes. 6 months later, Marcus was teaching younger kids spray paint techniques and staying out of trouble. Word about Officer Zara Mitchell began to spread through the neighborhood she patrolled. Not as someone to fear, but as someone who actually cared about the community she served. This approach didn't always make her popular with other officers. During her second year, Zara responded to a domestic violence call in a rundown apartment complex. The suspect, a man named Tony Rivera, had allegedly assaulted his girlfriend, Carmen Silva. When Zara and her partner, Officer Jake Murphy, arrived, Rivera was drunk, belligerent, and uncooperative. Murphy's instinct was to escalate. Put Rivera on the ground, cuff him, sort out the details later. But Zara noticed that Carmen Silva seemed more afraid of the police than she was of her boyfriend. Instead of immediately arresting Rivera, Zara asked Murphy to step back and let her handle the situation. She talked to Rivera calmly, got him to sit down, and convinced him to cooperate with questioning. She talked to Silva privately, away from both Rivera and Murphy, and discovered that Silva was undocumented and afraid that calling the police would result in her deportation. The situation required careful handling. Rivera had clearly been drinking and had left marks on Silva's arms, indicating assault. But Silva was reluctant to press charges because she feared interaction with law enforcement more than she feared her abusive boyfriend. Zara spent 3 hours on that call. She arranged for Silva to speak with a bilingual victim advocate. She connected Silva with immigration services to discuss her status. She made sure Rivera understood the consequences of domestic violence and connected him with anger management resources. Most importantly, she followed up. She checked on Silva weekly for the next 2 months, making sure she was safe, helping her navigate services, building trust between Silva and the police department. Officer Murphy complained to their supervisor that Zara was spending too much time on individual cases and not clearing enough calls per shift. But the results spoke for themselves. The 5th Precinct saw a significant decrease in repeat domestic violence calls from the neighborhoods Zara patrolled. Community complaints against police dropped. Cooperation with investigations increased. After 3 years as a patrol officer, Zara was promoted to detective and assigned to the Violent Crimes Unit. As a detective, Zara's thorough approach and community connections made her exceptionally effective. She solved cases that other detectives had written off as unsolvable because she understood that successful investigations required community trust. When 12-year-old Keisha Brown went missing from her neighborhood, the initial investigation focused on stranger abduction. Detectives canvassed the area, checked security cameras, and issued Amber Alerts. But after 48 hours with no leads, the case began to lose priority. Zara approached it differently. She spent time with Keisha's family, her friends, her teachers, her neighbors. She learned about Keisha's routine, her personality, her relationships. She discovered that Keisha had been afraid to walk home from school for the past month because a group of older kids had been harassing her. Following that lead, Zara learned that Keisha had been hiding out in an abandoned building rather than walking through the area where the older kids congregated. She hadn't been kidnapped. She was scared and didn't know how to ask for help. Zara found Keisha safe, arranged for her to get home safely, and worked with school officials to address the harassment issue that had caused the problem in the first place. But it was a case during her 5th year as a detective that cemented Zara's reputation and set her on the path to leadership. A series of armed robberies had been plaguing small businesses in 3 different precincts. The robberies seemed random, different types of businesses, different neighborhoods, different times of day. After 2 months, detectives from all 3 precincts had developed separate theories and were working separate leads, but no arrests had been made. Zara requested permission to coordinate the investigation across all 3 precincts. She analyzed patterns, mapped locations, interviewed victims, and studied security footage from all the incidents. What she discovered was that the robberies weren't random at all. They were following bus routes. The suspect was using public transportation to move between neighborhoods, targeting businesses near bus stops, and timing the robberies around bus schedules to ensure escape routes. More importantly, Zara realized that several potential witnesses had been reluctant to talk to police because of language barriers and immigration concerns, similar to what she had encountered in domestic violence cases. Working with community organizations and bilingual advocates, Zara was able to interview witnesses who had previously been overlooked. Their information led to the identification and arrest of the suspect within a week. The case made news not just because it was solved, but because of how it was solved. Zara's collaborative approach, her sensitivity to community concerns, and her analytical skills had succeeded where traditional investigative methods had failed. Detroit Police Chief Raymond Hayes took notice. Chief Hayes called Zara into his office and offered her a choice. She could be promoted to sergeant and continue working as a detective, or she could join the department's command training program and begin preparing for leadership positions. At 29 years old, Zara chose leadership. The command training program was intensive. Management courses, advanced constitutional law, budget administration, personnel management, community relations, media relations, crisis management, and strategic planning. She spent 2 years learning how to run a police department from the inside out. But the most important part of her training wasn't in a classroom. It was spending time with experienced commanders who understood that policing was changing, that communities were demanding more accountability, and that the next generation of police leaders would need to be different from the previous generation. Commander Patricia Williams, who oversaw the training program, explained it this way. The old model of policing was about control. Officers controlled situations, commanders controlled officers, and the department controlled the community. The new model is about collaboration. We work with the community to solve problems. We work with officers to develop solutions, and we work with everyone to build trust. Zara excelled in the program. She was promoted to sergeant at 31, lieutenant at 34, and captain at 37. As captain of the 5th Precinct, the same area where she had started as a patrol officer, Zara implemented community policing initiatives that became models for other precincts. Crime rates dropped, community satisfaction increased, and officer morale improved. But Zara wanted more impact than she could have in one precinct. When the police chief position opened in Phoenix, Arizona, Zara was ready. She had 17 years of experience, command training, a track record of successful community policing, and the vision to transform a department. Her interview with the Phoenix City Council lasted 3 hours. They asked about her philosophy of policing, her approach to officer discipline, her plans for community engagement, and her strategies for reducing crime while building trust. Council member Janet Ramond asked the question that sealed Zara's appointment. Chief Mitchell, how would you handle an officer who treats citizens differently based on their race or appearance? Zara's answer was direct: zero tolerance. An officer who cannot treat all citizens with equal respect and professionalism cannot serve in my department, period. 3 weeks later, she was offered the job. 2 weeks after that, she was on a plane to Phoenix carrying personnel files for every officer in the department, including the file for Officer Brad Coleman. She had read about his 4 citizen complaints in the past 2 years. She had seen the pattern of stops and arrests that seemed to disproportionately target people of color. She had noted that none of the complaints had resulted in significant discipline. She had made a mental note to address Officer Coleman's conduct as soon as she officially took over the department. She just hadn't expected to meet him on the courthouse steps first. But in retrospect, perhaps it was fitting. Her career had begun with watching her mother be mistreated by an officer who abused his authority. Now it would continue with her holding officers accountable for that same kind of abuse. As Zara climbed those courthouse steps after Coleman's removal, she thought about 8-year-old Zara in the back seat of that Honda Civic, watching injustice and promising herself that someday she would be in a position to do something about it. Someday had arrived. At exactly 11:03 a.m., 3 minutes after her official start time as Phoenix Police Chief, Zara Mitchell walked into the conference room at Phoenix Police Headquarters and found 17 commanding officers waiting for her first staff meeting. She had changed from her Navy courthouse suit into her crisp dress uniform. Her badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Her bearing was commanding but not intimidating. She carried herself like someone who belonged in that room, who had earned the right to sit at the head of that table. But the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Word had already spread through the department about what happened on the courthouse steps. Officer Brad Coleman had been suspended pending investigation. Captain Morrison had briefed the command staff, and everyone in that room was trying to figure out what this meant for them, for their officers, and for the department. Deputy Chief Frank Morrison, a 25-year veteran who had been serving as interim chief before Zara's appointment, stood as she entered. "Chief Mitchell," he said formally, "welcome to Phoenix PD." "Thank you, Deputy Chief Morrison." Zara took her seat at the head of the conference table and looked around the room, making eye contact with each officer present. "Before we discuss anything else," she said, "I want to address what happened this morning. I'm sure you've all heard various versions of the story, so let me give you the facts." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a digital recorder. "This is a recording of my encounter with Officer Coleman at the courthouse steps. You're going to listen to it now, all of it, because I want there to be no confusion about what transpired and no room for misinterpretation." For the next 12 minutes, the conference room was silent except for the sound of Coleman's voice ordering her to use the side entrance, threatening her with arrest and making it clear that his decision was based on her appearance rather than any legitimate law enforcement concern. When the recording ended, Zara set the device on the table and looked around the room again. "Questions?" she asked. Captain Lisa Santos, commander of the downtown district, raised her hand tentatively. "Chief, is Officer Coleman claiming he was following some kind of department protocol?" No, Captain Santos. There is no protocol that directs citizens to different entrances based on their appearance or race. Officer Coleman was acting on his own prejudices, and he was doing so while in uniform, representing this department. Captain David Klein, head of the Internal Affairs Division, leaned forward. Chief, we'll need to conduct a full investigation of this incident. Due process requires— Captain Klein, Zara interrupted, there will absolutely be a full investigation, but let me be clear about something. Due process protects Officer Coleman's right to a hearing and to respond to these charges. It does not protect him from consequences when his actions are clearly documented and witnessed by multiple people. She gestured toward the recorder. This isn't a he said, she said situation. This is documented misconduct captured on audio and video by multiple witnesses. Commander Robert Hayes from the Training Division spoke up. Chief, what's the department's exposure here? Legally speaking. Significant, Zara replied. Officer Coleman's actions constitute a clear violation of civil rights under color of law. The city could face federal lawsuit. The Department of Justice could open an investigation, and that's just the legal exposure. She stood and walked to the whiteboard at the front of the room. The bigger problem, she continued, writing as she spoke, is what this incident reveals about the culture of this department. She wrote 3 words on the board: accountability, training, oversight. Officer Coleman has been with this department for 15 years. His personnel file shows 4 citizen complaints in the past 2 years alone, all involving allegations of biased policing. None of those complaints resulted in meaningful discipline. Captain Morrison shifted in his seat. Chief, those complaints were investigated and dismissed, Zara finished. Every single one, which tells me that either the investigations were inadequate or the standards for officer conduct in this department are too low. She turned back to face the room. We're going to find out which one it is. Lieutenant Rosa Mendez from Community Relations raised her hand. Chief, what exactly are you proposing? A complete review of every complaint filed against every officer in this department for the past 5 years. We're going to look at how those complaints were investigated, what evidence was considered, and what decisions were made. The room stirred. Captain Santos looked uncomfortable. Deputy Chief Morrison frowned. Chief, Captain Klein said carefully, that's going to be hundreds of cases, maybe thousands. I know, Zara replied. We're going to start with any officer who has multiple complaints involving allegations of biased policing or excessive force. We're going to re-interview complainants who are willing to come forward, and we're going to determine whether this department has been protecting officers who should have been disciplined or terminated. Commander Hayes looked skeptical. Chief, with all due respect, this sounds like you're assuming guilt before conducting any investigation. Zara fixed him with a steady gaze. Commander Hayes, I'm assuming nothing. But when I have an officer threatening to arrest a citizen for using the main entrance to a public building, and when that same officer has multiple complaints that were all dismissed without consequences, I have to ask whether we've been doing our job. She walked back to her seat but remained standing. Let me tell you what's going to happen, she continued. Starting tomorrow, Captain Klein's Internal Affairs Division is going to begin a systematic review of every complaint involving Officer Coleman. Every witness will be re-interviewed. Every piece of evidence will be re-examined, and we're going to determine whether proper procedures were followed. Captain Klein nodded reluctantly. Yes, ma'am. While that's happening, Commander Hayes, your training division is going to develop a new curriculum focused on constitutional policing, de-escalation, and bias recognition. Every officer in this department is going to complete this training within 90 days. Hayes made notes on his pad. Understood. Captain Santos, your district commanders are going to meet with community leaders in their areas to discuss concerns about police conduct. Not PR meetings. Real conversations about real problems. Santos looked uncomfortable but nodded. Yes, Chief. And Deputy Chief Morrison, you're going to work with me to identify any other officers who might have similar patterns of complaints. We're going to address these issues proactively rather than waiting for them to become public scandals. Morrison's expression was unreadable. Yes, ma'am. Zara sat down and leaned forward, her hands folded on the table. I know some of you are thinking this is an overreaction to one incident. That Officer Coleman made a mistake, and now we're turning the entire department upside down because of it. Several officers shifted in their seats, confirming her suspicion. But here's what I need you to understand, she continued. This isn't about one officer or one incident. This is about whether this department is going to be trusted by the community we serve. Lieutenant Mendez spoke up. Chief, morale is going to be a concern. Officers are going to feel like they're being presumed guilty. Then we need to make sure innocent officers have nothing to worry about, Zara replied. Good officers who treat all citizens with respect and follow proper procedures will be protected and supported. Officers who abuse their authority will be held accountable. She stood again and walked to the window overlooking the parking lot, where patrol cars were lined up ready for the day shift. When I was 8 years old, she said, still facing the window, my mother was pulled over by a police officer who treated her like a criminal for driving through a broken traffic light. I watched from the back seat as he humiliated her, issued her tickets she didn't deserve, and made her feel like she was worthless. She turned back to face the room. That officer thought no one important was watching, just like Officer Coleman thought this morning. But someone is always watching, and when we wear this badge, we represent every officer who has ever worn it. Captain Santos cleared her throat. Chief, what about Officer Coleman specifically? What's his status? Officer Coleman is suspended without pay pending the outcome of the investigation. Depending on what that investigation reveals, he will either face disciplinary action up to and including termination, or he will face criminal charges, or both. The room was quiet for a moment, absorbing the gravity of her statement. Captain Klein spoke again. Chief, if we're going to reopen old cases, we need to be prepared for media attention. This morning's incident is already making news. I'm aware of that, Zara replied. In fact, I'm scheduling a press conference for this afternoon. The community has a right to know what happened and what we're doing about it. Deputy Chief Morrison looked alarmed. Chief, might it be better to handle this internally first? No, Deputy Chief. The community lost trust in this department because too many things were handled internally. We're going to be transparent about our problems and transparent about our solutions. She returned to the whiteboard and wrote one more word, trust. Everything we do from this point forward is about rebuilding trust. With the community, with honest officers, and with the families who send their loved ones out in uniform every day, hoping they'll come home safely and with their integrity intact. Commander Hayes raised his hand. Chief, what specific changes should officers expect in terms of day-to-day operations? Excellent question, Zara replied. Starting immediately, all officers will wear body cameras during any interaction with the public, no exceptions. Several officers exchanged glances. Body cameras had been a contentious issue in the department for years. Any officer who fails to activate their body camera during a public interaction will face disciplinary action. Any officer whose body camera mysteriously malfunctions during a controversial incident will be presumed to have disabled it intentionally. Captain Klein looked concerned. Chief, the officers' union is going to have issues with that presumption. Then the union can explain to the public why they think officers should be allowed to turn off cameras during controversial incidents, Zara replied. I'm not interested in protecting officers who have something to hide. She walked back to her seat and opened another folder. Second change, complaint procedures. Citizens will be able to file complaints online, in person, or by phone. Every complaint will be investigated by internal affairs, not by the officer's immediate supervisor or district commander. This drew more murmurs from around the table. Third change, use of force reporting. Anytime an officer uses force beyond basic compliance techniques, they will submit a detailed report within 24 hours. These reports will be reviewed by internal affairs and by an outside civilian review board. Captain Santos shook her head. Chief, that's going to generate an enormous amount of paperwork. Good, Zara replied. If officers have to write detailed reports about every use of force, they'll think twice before using force unnecessarily. Lieutenant Mendez leaned forward. Chief, what about support for officers who are doing their jobs correctly? This all sounds very punitive. You're absolutely right, Lieutenant. We're also implementing new programs to support good officers. Performance bonuses for officers with no complaint history. Priority consideration for special assignments and promotions for officers with exemplary community relations records. Additional training opportunities for officers who demonstrate leadership potential. She closed the folder and looked around the room one more time. The bottom line is this. We're going to be a department that the community can trust and that good officers can be proud of. If that means getting rid of officers who can't meet professional standards, then that's what we're going to do. Deputy Chief Morrison spoke up. Chief, what's the timeline for all of these changes? 90 days for the training programs? 60 days for the new complaint procedures, 30 days for the body camera requirements, and the investigation into Officer Coleman and similar cases starts immediately. Captain Klein made more notes. Chief, I'll need additional staff for internal affairs to handle the increased caseload. You'll have it, Zara replied. This is our top priority. Commander Hayes looked up from his note-taking. Chief, one more question. What happens if we uncover misconduct that goes beyond individual officers? What if we find systematic problems? Then we fix the system, Zara replied, even if it means rebuilding this department from the ground up. The meeting continued for another hour, covering operational details, budget implications, and implementation timelines. But the message was clear. Change was coming, and it was coming fast. When the meeting ended, Deputy Chief Morrison approached Zara privately. Chief, he said quietly, you're moving very aggressively on this. Are you sure you want to make so many enemies so quickly? Zara gathered her files and looked at him directly. Deputy Chief Morrison, I didn't come here to make friends. I came here to run a police department that serves the community with integrity and professionalism. If that makes me enemies among officers who can't meet those standards, then so be it. 2 hours later, Zara held her press conference. The police headquarters press room was packed with reporters from local television stations, newspapers, and radio stations. Elena Ramond was there representing the Spanish-language media. David Park attended as a representative of the prosecutor's office. Zara stepped to the podium at exactly 2 p.m. Good afternoon, she began. My name is Zara Mitchell, and I am the new police chief for the Phoenix Police Department. I'm here to address an incident that occurred this morning involving one of our officers. She recounted the courthouse steps encounter in detail, holding nothing back. She played portions of the audio recording. She acknowledged the seriousness of the situation and outlined the steps the department would take in response. When she opened the floor to questions, the first one came from Maria Gonzalez of Channel 12 News. Chief Mitchell, is this incident representative of a broader problem within the Phoenix Police Department? Yes, Zara replied without hesitation. Based on my review of complaint records and disciplinary actions, I believe this department has failed to hold officers accountable for misconduct, particularly misconduct involving bias against minority citizens. The room buzzed with activity as reporters made notes and camera operators adjusted their angles. James Patterson from the Arizona Republic raised his hand. Chief, what specific steps are you taking to address these problems? Zara outlined the investigation protocols, the new training requirements, the body camera mandate, and the Civilian Review Board. Another reporter, Lisa Wong from Channel 15, asked, Chief, how do you respond to critics who might say you're being too harsh based on one incident? This isn't about one incident, Zara replied. This is about a pattern of behavior that has been tolerated for too long. When citizens lose trust in police, everyone suffers. Good officers suffer because they're painted with the same brush as bad officers. The community suffers because they don't feel safe calling police when they need help. And public safety suffers because police work requires community cooperation. Robert Martinez from KPHO News asked, what's your message to officers who might be concerned about these changes? My message is simple. If you're doing your job professionally and treating all citizens with respect, you have nothing to fear from increased accountability. If you're not, then you need to change or find another profession. Elena Ramond raised her hand. Chief, the Latino community in Phoenix has had particularly difficult relationships with police in recent years. What's your plan for rebuilding trust in those communities? We're going to start by listening, Zara replied. Captain Santos will be organizing community meetings in every district. Not meetings where we talk at the community, but meetings where we listen to their concerns and work with them to develop solutions. The press conference lasted 45 minutes. When it ended, Zara knew that her words would be replayed on evening newscasts throughout the city and that the community would be watching to see if her actions matched her promises. But she also knew something else. In the 3 hours since Officer Coleman had been suspended, 4 citizens had already called the department to report similar incidents involving other officers. The investigation was just beginning. That evening, Zara sat in her temporary office, reviewing the preliminary findings from Captain Klein's Internal Affairs Division. Officer Coleman's case wasn't isolated. Over the past 5 years, 17 officers had multiple complaints involving allegations of biased policing. Of those 17, only 2 had received any discipline beyond verbal warnings. Officer Janet Torres had 3 complaints involving traffic stops of Hispanic drivers that seemed pretextual. No discipline. Officer Mike Daniels had 5 complaints involving use of force against black suspects that witnesses described as excessive. 1 verbal counseling session. Officer Susan Wright had 4 complaints involving hostile treatment of citizens during routine interactions. No discipline. The pattern was clear and disturbing. Zara's phone buzzed with a text message from Captain Klein. Chief, we have a problem. Just received call from city attorney. Officer Coleman is threatening to sue the city for wrongful termination. Claims he was following department protocol. Zara typed back, schedule meeting with city attorney for tomorrow morning. We need to review Coleman's personnel file line by line. If he wants to claim he was following protocol, let's see what protocol he's referring to. Another text, this one from Deputy Chief Morrison. Media requests are flooding in. CNN wants interview. National news picking up story. Her response? No national interviews until we have preliminary investigation results. Focus on local accountability first. As Zara prepared to leave the office, she reflected on how much had changed in one day. This morning, she had been an unknown police chief taking over a department. Tonight, she was at the center of a national conversation about police accountability and bias. But the real work wasn't the press conferences or the media attention. The real work was in the files on her desk, the complaints that had been ignored, the officers who had escaped consequences, and the citizens who had been mistreated. Tomorrow, that work would begin in earnest. 3 weeks after the courthouse steps incident, Zara Mitchell's investigation had uncovered something far worse than one racist officer. It had revealed a systematic pattern of misconduct that had been covered up, ignored, and enabled by department leadership for years. The Internal Affairs conference room looked like a war room. Whiteboards covered every wall, filled with names, dates, complaint numbers, and connecting lines that showed relationships between incidents. File boxes were stacked on tables containing thousands of pages of police reports, complaint forms, witness statements, and disciplinary records. Captain Klein stood at the main whiteboard, pointing to a timeline that stretched across the entire wall. Chief, he said, his voice grim, this is bigger than we initially thought. Zara sat at the conference table, surrounded by senior investigators and outside consultants she had brought in to ensure objectivity. Elena Ramond was there as a Spanish-language interpreter. David Park represented the prosecutor's office, and Dr. Patricia Nguyen, a police accountability expert from Arizona State University, had been hired to provide independent analysis. Show me what you found, Zara said. Captain Klein picked up a red marker and circled a cluster of names on the timeline. We identified 23 officers with multiple complaints involving alleged bias or excessive force. But when we started digging deeper, we found something interesting. He drew lines connecting the names. 15 of these officers all worked under the same supervisors at different times. Lieutenant Gary Stevens in the downtown district, Sergeant Michael Torres in traffic enforcement, and Sergeant Helen Walsh in the patrol division. Dr. Nguyen leaned forward. That suggests a cultural problem rather than isolated incidents. Exactly, Captain Klein replied, but it gets worse. He moved to a second whiteboard, this one showing complaint processing procedures. We reviewed every complaint filed against these officers over the past 5 years. Here's what we found. Complaints against officers supervised by Stevens, Torres, and Walsh were significantly more likely to be dismissed than complaints against other officers. David Park made notes on his legal pad. What kind of dismissal rate are we talking about? 87%, Klein replied, compared to 62% for the department overall. The room went quiet as the implications sank in. Zara stood and walked to the whiteboard. Show me the specific cases. Klein opened a thick file folder. Officer Coleman, 4 complaints, all dismissed. Officer Janet Torres, 3 complaints, all dismissed. Officer Mike Daniels, 5 complaints, 1 sustained with verbal counseling. He continued down the list, name after name, complaint after complaint, dismissal after dismissal. What reasons were given for the dismissals? Zara asked. The usual ones, Klein replied. Insufficient evidence. Witness credibility issues. Complainant failed to cooperate with investigation. Elena Ramon spoke up. Chief, I've been reviewing the Spanish language complaints, and I found something troubling. Several complainants said they tried to file complaints but were discouraged by desk officers who told them their English wasn't good enough or that they needed documentation they didn't have. Dr. Nguyen nodded grimly. That's a common tactic for suppressing complaints in departments with poor accountability cultures. Zara walked to the window overlooking the parking lot. In the 3 weeks since she had taken over, community meetings had been standing room only. Citizens were coming forward with stories of police misconduct that went back years. The local NAACP chapter had provided a list of 47 cases where Black citizens felt they had been treated unfairly by police, but hadn't filed formal complaints because they didn't think anyone would listen. The Latino Community Council had documented 32 similar cases involving Hispanic citizens. The Asian American Coalition had reported 18 incidents involving officers who seemed to assume that Asian citizens didn't speak English well enough to understand their rights. Tell me about the supervisors, Zara said, turning back to the room. Stevens, Torres, and Walsh. What's their story? Captain Klein consulted another file. Lieutenant Stevens has been with the department for 18 years, promoted to lieutenant 5 years ago. No disciplinary actions in his file, but he's supervised more officers with complaint histories than any other lieutenant. Sergeant Torres, 15 years on the force, promoted to sergeant 3 years ago. Also clean disciplinary record, but again, high number of problematic officers under his supervision. Sergeant Walsh, 12 years, promoted to sergeant 2 years ago. Same pattern. David Park looked up from his notes. That's either the unluckiest supervision assignments in the history of policing, or these supervisors were actively protecting problem officers. Dr. Nguyen had been reviewing complaint files while Klein spoke. She held up a thick folder. I've been analyzing the language used in dismissal reports, she said. There are striking similarities in how these complaints were documented and dismissed. Almost like they were following a template for how to justify not taking action. She opened the folder and read from several reports. Complainant appeared hostile and uncooperative during interview. This phrase appears in 17 different dismissal reports signed by these 3 supervisors. Insufficient evidence to substantiate claims despite thorough investigation. This exact language appears in 24 reports. Witness statements contradictory and unreliable. 14 reports. The patterns are too consistent to be coincidental, she concluded. Zara returned to her seat at the head of the table. What about Officer Coleman specifically? What does his record show? Klein pulled out a separate file, this one even thicker than the others. Coleman's record is particularly troubling, he said. 4 formal complaints in 2 years, but also 7 informal complaints that never resulted in investigations. What do you mean, informal complaints? Zara asked. Citizens who called to complain about Coleman's behavior but were told by supervisors that formal complaints required in-person interviews, written statements, and multiple follow-up meetings. Many citizens couldn't take time off work or didn't feel comfortable going through that process. Elena Raymond raised her hand. I spoke with Maria Santos, one of the women who filed a formal complaint against Coleman last year. She said Lieutenant Stevens interviewed her for over an hour, asking detailed questions about her personal life, her job, her family status. She felt like she was being investigated instead of Officer Coleman. David Park shook his head. That's intimidation, not investigation. Dr. Nguyen had been taking notes throughout the discussion. She looked up from her notepad. Chief Mitchell, based on what I'm hearing, this isn't just about individual officer misconduct. This appears to be a systematic effort to suppress accountability and protect officers who engage in biased policing. Zara had been thinking the same thing. The evidence was pointing to something much larger and more troubling than a few bad officers. Captain Klein, she said, I want you to expand the investigation. Look at every complaint handled by Stevens, Torres, and Walsh over the past 5 years. Re-interview every complainant who's willing to cooperate. And I want polygraph examinations for all 3 supervisors. Klein nodded. Yes, ma'am. Dr. Nguyen, continue your analysis of complaint processing procedures. I want to know if there were written or unwritten policies that discourage thorough investigations. Will do, Chief. Elena, I want you to work with community organizations to identify citizens who wanted to file complaints but were discouraged from doing so. We need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. Elena nodded. I can have initial interviews completed within 2 weeks. David Park, I need to know what our legal exposure is if this investigation confirms systematic civil rights violations. Park consulted his notes. Chief, if we can document intentional suppression of complaint investigations, especially with evidence of supervisory involvement, we're looking at potential federal civil rights lawsuits, Department of Justice intervention, and possibly federal criminal charges. The gravity of his statement settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Zara stood again and walked to the main whiteboard, looking at the web of names, dates, and connections that told the story of institutional failure. How many citizens do you think were mistreated by officers who should have been disciplined or fired years ago? She asked the room. No one answered because there was no way to know. But everyone understood that the number was probably much higher than any of them wanted to imagine. 3 hours later, Zara called a press conference. The police headquarters press room was even more crowded than it had been 3 weeks earlier. Local news crews had been joined by reporters from national media outlets. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and major newspapers had all sent correspondents to cover what was becoming a national story about police accountability. Zara stepped to the podium at exactly 4 p.m. Good afternoon, she began. 3 weeks ago, I told you that the incident involving Officer Coleman was part of a broader problem within this department. Today, I can provide you with specific information about what our investigation has revealed. She outlined the findings methodically. 23 officers with multiple complaints. Systematic dismissal of complaints by certain supervisors. Evidence of intimidation tactics used against complainants. A culture that protected problem officers rather than holding them accountable. The numbers were staggering. Over 200 complaints dismissed without proper investigation. Dozens of citizens discouraged from filing formal complaints. A pattern of misconduct that went back years and involved multiple levels of the department. When she opened the floor to questions, the first came from Sarah Johnson of CNN. Chief Mitchell, are you alleging that there was an intentional conspiracy to cover up police misconduct? I'm stating that our investigation has found evidence of systematic failures in complaint processing and officer supervision that appear to be intentional, Zara replied. Whether that constitutes a criminal conspiracy will be determined by prosecutors and possibly federal authorities. James Patterson from the Arizona Republic raised his hand. Chief, what specific actions are you taking against the officers and supervisors involved? Officer Coleman remains suspended without pay pending criminal charges. Officers Torres and Daniels have been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. 3 additional officers have been suspended. She paused, knowing her next statement would make headlines. Lieutenant Stevens, Sergeant Torres, and Sergeant Walsh have been relieved of supervisory duties and placed on administrative leave pending investigation into their handling of complaint procedures. The room erupted with activity as reporters made notes and camera operators focused on her face. Lisa Wong from Channel 15 asked, "Chief, how do you respond to criticism from the police officers union that you're conducting a witch hunt against dedicated officers?" "This isn't a witch hunt," Zara replied firmly. "This is accountability. For too long, this department protected officers who violated citizens' rights and intimidated citizens who tried to seek justice. That ends now." Robert Martinez from KPHO asked, "What's your message to citizens who may have been mistreated by police but never filed complaints?" "My message is that we want to hear from you. We've established a special hotline staffed by independent investigators. We've created online complaint forms in multiple languages. And we've partnered with community organizations to make sure every citizen knows they have the right to file complaints without fear of retaliation." Elena Raymond raised her hand. "Chief, what changes are you making to prevent these problems in the future?" "Every supervisor in this department is being retrained on complaint investigation procedures. We're implementing new oversight mechanisms to ensure complaints are properly investigated. And we're establishing a civilian review board with subpoena power to independently investigate serious misconduct allegations." The press conference continued for over an hour. When it ended, Zara knew that Phoenix PD was now under national scrutiny, that federal agencies were likely to take interest, and that her reform efforts would be watched and judged by police departments across the country. But she also knew something else. In the 3 weeks since her investigation began, crime reports had actually increased in several neighborhoods, particularly minority communities. Citizens who had previously been reluctant to call police were now more willing to report crimes because they had confidence that officers would be held accountable for their conduct. That evening, Zara received a call from Deputy Chief Morrison. "Chief," he said, his voice strained, "I need to meet with you privately. There's something else you need to know." They met in her office an hour later. Morrison looked exhausted and worried. "Chief," he began, "I've been reviewing personnel files for the officers under investigation, and I found something that changes everything." He placed a file on her desk. "Officer Coleman's disciplinary record that we've been working from? It's incomplete." Zara opened the file. "What do you mean?" Morrison pulled out a second set of documents. "These are Coleman's original personnel records stored in a separate filing system that Internal Affairs doesn't normally access. Coleman has had 17 complaints over his 15-year career, not 4. Zara stared at the documents in disbelief. 13 complaints were removed from his active file and stored in what's called the Historical Records System. Complaints that resulted in what were supposed to be permanent disciplinary actions were reclassified as resolved counseling sessions and archived. "Who authorized the reclassification?" Zara asked. "Multiple supervisors over the years," Morrison replied. "But the pattern started about 8 years ago, right after Lieutenant Stevens was promoted." Zara felt a chill run down her spine. "How many other officers have incomplete active files?" Morrison's expression was grim. "Based on what I've found so far, potentially dozens." The investigation had just expanded exponentially. What had started as accountability for one incident had become an examination of systematic corruption that went to the heart of the department's leadership structure. Zara looked out her office window at the city lights of Phoenix, thinking about all the citizens who had been failed by the very people sworn to protect them. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to call in federal investigators, knowing that such a step would essentially place the entire Phoenix Police Department under federal oversight. But tonight, she knew that the reckoning was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. 6 months after the courthouse steps incident, Phoenix Police Department looked nothing like the organization Zara Mitchell had inherited. The morning briefing room at headquarters buzzed with energy. But it was a different kind of energy than before. Officers who had once dreaded going to work now arrived early to check community engagement reports. Supervisors who had once focused solely on arrest statistics now spent time reviewing citizen feedback scores. And the command staff that had once protected problem officers now actively identified and addressed concerning behavior patterns before they became complaints. Zara stood at the front of the briefing room, looking out at 47 officers from across the department. These were her success stories. Officers who had embraced the new culture, excelled under the new accountability standards, and demonstrated what professional policing could look like. But she was also looking at a department that had been fundamentally transformed through one of the most painful periods in its history. The investigation that began with Officer Coleman had ultimately resulted in the termination of 11 officers, the demotion of 4 supervisors, and the complete restructuring of the department's complaint investigation process. Federal prosecutors had filed civil rights charges against Coleman and 2 other officers. The Department of Justice had opened a formal investigation that resulted in a consent decree requiring ongoing federal oversight. Most importantly, the culture had changed. Officer Dante Richardson, a 3-year veteran who had been present during some of Coleman's problematic stops but had never spoken up, was now leading the department's new peer intervention program. Sergeant Keisha Williams, promoted after Lieutenant Stevens was demoted, was training supervisors throughout Arizona on recognizing and addressing officer misconduct. Captain Elena Ramond, promoted from her previous role in community relations, was now running what had become a national model for civilian oversight of police departments. "Good morning," Zara said to the assembled officers. 6 months ago, this department was in crisis. Today, we're being studied by police departments across the country as an example of how to rebuild community trust. She clicked a remote and a slide appeared on the screen showing crime statistics. Violent crime is down 12% from last year. Property crime is down 8%, but more importantly, complaints against officers are down 63%. And citizen satisfaction scores are at the highest level in the department's history. Applause filled the room, but Zara raised her hand for quiet. "Those numbers didn't happen by accident," she continued. "They happened because each of you made a choice to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem." Officer Richardson raised his hand. "Chief, can you give us an update on Officer Coleman's case?" "Coleman pled guilty to federal civil rights violations last month," Zara replied. "He was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison and is permanently barred from working in law enforcement." She clicked to the next slide, showing a photo of the courthouse steps where everything had started. But Coleman's conviction isn't the end of this story. It's the beginning of a new chapter for this department and for the community we serve. The slide changed to show a photo from the previous week's Community Policing Awards ceremony, where citizens had nominated officers for outstanding service. Officer Martinez, who had been one of the 47 selected for the briefing, stood up. "Chief, I want to thank you for what you've done. 6 months ago, I was ashamed to tell people I was a police officer. Now I'm proud of it again." Similar sentiments were echoed around the room. Officers talking about restored pride, rebuilt relationships with the community, and a sense that their work mattered in positive ways. But Zara knew the real test wasn't in this room, with officers who had embraced change. The real test was in the community, with citizens who had been failed by the department for years. That afternoon, she attended a community meeting in the same neighborhood where Officer Coleman had made many of his problematic stops. The meeting was held at Mount Olive Baptist Church, and the sanctuary was packed with residents who 6 months earlier had been afraid to call police when they needed help. Reverend Marcus Thompson, the church's pastor, introduced Zara to the crowd. 6 months ago, he said, many of us had lost faith that things could ever change. Chief Mitchell has shown us that change is possible, but more importantly, she's shown us that change requires courage from everyone, police and community alike. Zara stepped to the podium and looked out at faces that reflected the diversity of Phoenix. Black families, Latino families, Asian families, white families, all sitting together in a church sanctuary to talk about policing and community safety. 6 months ago, she began, I made you a promise. I promised that this department would treat every citizen with respect and dignity, regardless of race, ethnicity, or economic status. I promised accountability for officers who violate that standard. And I promise transparency in how we handle complaints and discipline." She paused, making eye contact with several community members in the front rows. "Today, I want to report back to you on how we've kept those promises." She outlined the changes that had been implemented. The new complaint process that had resulted in a 400% increase in citizen reports, but also a 300% increase in sustained findings against officers. The Civilian Review Board that had independently investigated 12 cases and issued public reports on each one. The community policing initiatives that had put officers back on foot patrol in neighborhoods where trust had been broken. Most importantly, she talked about the culture change within the department. We now have officers who are required to intervene when they see colleagues engaging in inappropriate behavior. We have supervisors who are evaluated based on their officers' community relationships, not just their arrest statistics. And we have a command staff that understands our job is to serve the community, not control it. Mrs. Dorothy Fleming, an elderly black woman who had been one of the first citizens to file a complaint under the new system, stood up to speak. "Chief Mitchell," she said, her voice strong despite her age. "6 months ago, my grandson was stopped by one of your officers for walking through his own neighborhood. The officer treated him like a criminal, searched him without cause, and threatened him with arrest for asking questions." The room was quiet, listening intently. "Under your new system, I filed a complaint. That officer was retrained, disciplined, and required to apologize to my grandson in person. But more than that, I've watched him in our neighborhood since then, and he's different. He waves at kids. He talks to business owners. He acts like he works for us instead of against us." Applause erupted throughout the sanctuary. "Chief," she said in accented English, "6 months ago I was afraid of police. My children were afraid. Now my daughter wants to be a police officer because she sees officers in our neighborhood who care about our community." More applause, stronger this time. But it was the next speaker who delivered the most powerful testimony. Malik Washington, a 19-year-old black man, approached the microphone. "Chief Mitchell," he said, "I need to tell you something. Last month I was stopped by one of your officers while I was walking home from work. It was late, I was tired, and when I saw those blue lights I got scared." The room was completely silent now. "But Officer Martinez, who's here tonight, he treated me with respect. He explained why he stopped me. There had been reports of break-ins in the area, and he was checking on anyone walking alone late at night. He was polite, professional, and when he realized I lived in the neighborhood, he offered to give me a ride home so I'd be safe." Malik turned to face Officer Martinez, who was sitting in the third row. "That's the kind of police officer I want in my neighborhood. Someone who sees me as a person to protect, not a suspect to harass." The applause that followed was thunderous, and Zara saw tears in the eyes of several officers present. After the formal presentations, Zara mingled with community members, listening to their stories, answering their questions, and taking notes on their suggestions for further improvements. Elena Raman, now Captain Raman, approached her near the end of the evening. "Chief," she said quietly, "there's something you should know. We just received word that 3 other police departments have requested consultations on implementing similar accountability measures. And the Department of Justice is considering using our reforms as a model for other consent decrees." Zara smiled. "That's good news, but let's make sure we keep improving before we start teaching others." As the evening wound down, Zara reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. It had started with one officer's prejudice and escalated into a comprehensive examination of institutional failure. But through the pain of confronting hard truths, they had built something better. The Phoenix Police Department was no longer just a law enforcement agency. It had become a model for what policing could be when accountability, transparency, and community engagement were prioritized over protecting bad officers and maintaining the status quo. As Zara drove home through the neighborhoods her officers now served with pride and professionalism, she thought about 8-year-old Zara watching her mother be humiliated by Officer Kruger in Detroit. That little girl had promised herself that someday she would be in a position to make sure power was used to protect people, not hurt them. Today, that promise was being kept, not just for her, but for every citizen who deserved to be treated with dignity and respect by the officers sworn to serve them. The transformation was complete, but the work of maintaining it would continue every day, one interaction at a time, one officer at a time, one community meeting at a time. Because real change wasn't something you achieved once. It was something you chose to uphold every single day. And in Phoenix, they were making that choice every day. The courthouse steps looked the same as they had on that Tuesday morning a year ago. The same marble, the same glass doors, the same flow of people moving in and out of the building seeking justice in its various forms. But everything else had changed. Zara Mitchell stood at the top of those steps, not as someone being denied entry, but as the keynote speaker at the National Police Chiefs Association's annual conference on community policing and accountability. Representatives from police departments across the country had come to Phoenix to learn about what had become known as the Phoenix Model. Behind her, etched into a bronze plaque that had been installed 6 months earlier, were the words that had become the department's new motto: accountability, transparency, community. Elena Raymond, now Deputy Chief Raymond, stood beside her reviewing the final notes for Zara's presentation. "Nervous?" Elena asked. Zara smiled. "No, hopeful." In the year since Officer Coleman's arrest, the changes in Phoenix had rippled outward in ways no one had anticipated. The Department of Justice had cited the Phoenix Police Department as a model for reform in 3 other cities. University researchers had published papers on their accountability measures. Police academies had begun incorporating Phoenix's training protocols into their curricula. But the real measure of success wasn't academic recognition or national attention. It was in the statistics that told the story of a department transformed. Citizen complaints had dropped by 78% from the previous year. Community satisfaction surveys showed approval ratings of 87%, the highest in the Southwest. Officer retention had increased as good cops chose to stay in a department they could be proud of. Crime clearance rates had improved as community cooperation with investigations increased. Use of force incidents had decreased by 65% as officers focused on de-escalation. Most importantly, the department had successfully recruited a diverse new class of officers who were attracted to the reformed culture and high professional standards. Officer Dante Richardson had been promoted to sergeant and was now training new recruits in peer intervention techniques. Marcus Robinson, the teenager Zara had connected with art classes during her Detroit patrol days, had followed her to Phoenix and was now in his 2nd year at the police academy. But perhaps the most significant change was in the relationship between the department and the community it served. The monthly community meetings that had started as crisis management sessions had evolved into collaborative problem-solving forums. Neighborhood watch programs had tripled in participation. Youth engagement initiatives had reduced juvenile crime by 40%. And for the first time in years, police officers regularly walked beats in neighborhoods where they were welcomed rather than feared. As Zara prepared to address the national conference, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. It had started with watching her mother be humiliated by a traffic stop in Detroit. It had been shaped by her military service, her years as a patrol officer and detective, and her gradual rise through the ranks of leadership. But it had crystallized in that moment on the courthouse steps when Officer Coleman's prejudice had revealed itself in full public view. "Chief Mitchell?" A conference organizer approached with a wireless microphone. "We're ready for you." Zara nodded and walked to the podium that had been set up on the courthouse plaza. Nearly 300 police chiefs, mayors, city council members, and community leaders filled the space where, a year ago, Coleman had threatened to arrest her for trying to enter a public building. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the plaza. "A year ago, I stood on these same steps as a citizen being denied access to this courthouse by a police officer who decided I didn't belong based on the color of my skin." She gestured toward the bronze plaque behind her. "Today, I stand here as proof that accountability, transparency, and community engagement aren't just ideals to aspire to. They're practical tools that can transform how police departments serve their communities. For the next 45 minutes, Zara detailed the Phoenix experience, the painful process of investigation that had revealed systematic problems, the difficult decisions to terminate officers and supervisors who had enabled misconduct, the gradual rebuilding of community trust through consistent action rather than empty promises. But she also talked about the officers who had embraced change, the community members who had been willing to give the department another chance, and the collaborative work that had made transformation possible. Change is hard, she concluded. It requires admitting that things you've done in the past were wrong. It requires holding people accountable when you'd rather just move on. It requires listening to criticism from communities you've failed and working to earn back trust you've lost. She paused, looking out at the faces of law enforcement leaders from across the country. But change is also necessary, because the choice isn't between perfect policing and imperfect policing. The choice is between policing that serves all members of the community with equal respect and dignity, and policing that reflects and reinforces the biases and prejudices that divide us. The applause that followed was sustained and genuine. These weren't people being polite at a formal event. These were professionals who understood the challenges of modern policing and were hungry for models that actually worked. During the question and answer session that followed, Zara was asked about the most difficult part of the transformation process. "The hardest thing," she replied, "wasn't identifying the problems or even implementing the solutions. The hardest thing was maintaining hope during the darkest moments of the investigation, when we were uncovering failure after failure and wondering if we could ever rebuild something worth believing in." Chief Robert Martinez from San Antonio asked about officer morale during the reform process. "Morale was terrible at first," Zara admitted. "Good officers were angry that they were being painted with the same brush as bad officers. Bad officers were angry that they were being held accountable for behavior they'd gotten away with for years. But as the reforms took effect, good officers realized they were being protected and supported in ways they never had been before, and the officers who couldn't adapt to professional standards found other careers." Mayor Patricia Williams from Detroit asked about community resistance to police-led reform efforts. "The community didn't resist," Zara replied. "They were skeptical, and rightfully so. They'd heard promises before. But when they saw officers being fired for misconduct instead of protected, when they saw complaint investigations being conducted transparently instead of covered up, and when they saw officers in their neighborhoods acting like partners instead of occupiers, skepticism turned into cautious optimism and eventually into genuine collaboration." The final question came from Chief David Casper of Oakland, California. "Chief Mitchell, what would you say to a police leader who wants to implement similar reforms but is facing resistance from officers, unions, or city officials?" Zara thought for a moment before answering. "I'd say that leadership isn't about making popular decisions. It's about making necessary decisions. Every community in America deserves professional, accountable, constitutional policing. If you're not providing that, you're not doing your job as a law enforcement leader." She gestured toward the courthouse behind her. "And I'd remind them that change is coming whether they lead it or not. The question is whether they want to be part of building something better, or whether they want to be swept away by the consequences of maintaining systems that don't serve the people they're sworn to protect." As the conference concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Zara was approached by dozens of chiefs and mayors wanting to discuss implementation details, timeline considerations, and political strategies for reform. But the conversation that meant the most to her came from an unexpected source. "Chief Mitchell?" Zara turned to see a young black woman in a business suit, probably in her late 20s, with a notebook and press credentials. "I'm Jessica Coleman, reporter for the Arizona Republic. I was wondering if I could ask you a few questions." "Of course," Zara replied, not immediately registering the significance of the last name. "I wanted to ask about the long-term sustainability of the reforms you've implemented. But first, I should mention that Brad Coleman is my uncle." Zara's expression shifted to one of careful attention. I grew up hearing his version of what happened on these steps, Jessica continued, about how he was just doing his job, how he was treated unfairly, how his career was destroyed by politics and media attention. She paused, looking up at the courthouse steps. But I've spent the past year researching the real story, talking to community members, reviewing court records, studying the investigation findings, and I wanted you to know that what happened here, what you did, it mattered. Zara waited, letting the young woman continue. My uncle was wrong, not just about that day, but about his entire approach to policing. He hurt people, he violated people's rights, and he did it for years while the department protected him. Jessica's voice was steady, professional, but Zara could hear the emotion underneath. I became a journalist partly because I wanted to understand how institutions fail people and how they can be fixed. Your reforms here in Phoenix, they're not perfect, but they're proof that change is possible. Thank you for saying that, Zara replied. And thank you for being willing to look at the evidence rather than just accepting someone's version of events. Jessica made a few notes. Can I ask you about sustainability? How do you ensure that these changes outlast your tenure as chief? Good question. We've built accountability into every level of the system. The Civilian Review Board has independent authority. The complaint investigation process is transparent and standardized. Officer evaluation includes community feedback. And most importantly, we've hired and promoted people who believe in these principles. She looked around the courthouse plaza, where a few conference attendees were still gathered in small groups, discussing implementation strategies. But ultimately, sustaining change requires constant vigilance. It requires community engagement. It requires leaders who are willing to make hard decisions. And it requires citizens who hold their public servants accountable. Jessica finished taking notes and looked up. One final question, if you don't mind. Do you ever regret how things unfolded? The public nature of my uncle's downfall, the media attention, the way it all played out? Zara considered the question carefully. I regret that your uncle chose to abuse his authority in the first place. I regret that the department failed to address his conduct before it reached that point. And I regret that it took a public incident to force the kind of accountability that should have been happening all along. She paused, choosing her words thoughtfully. But I don't regret holding him accountable for his actions. I don't regret investigating the systematic problems his case revealed. And I don't regret implementing reforms that have made this community safer and fairer for everyone. Jessica nodded. Thank you, Chief. I think that's exactly what needed to be said. As Jessica walked away, Zara reflected on the conversation. A year ago, she never could have imagined having a respectful, professional discussion with a member of Officer Coleman's family. But here they were, two people from opposite sides of a painful situation, finding common ground in their commitment to truth and justice. Elena Ramon approached as Zara gathered her materials. Ready to head back to the office? Elena asked. Almost. Zara walked to the bronze plaque and read the inscription one more time. Accountability, transparency, community. Simple words, Elena observed. Simple to say, Zara replied. Harder to live up to every day. They walked down the courthouse steps together, past the spot where Officer Coleman had demanded that Zara use the side entrance, past the place where her career as Phoenix police chief had truly begun. As they reached the bottom of the steps, Zara's phone buzzed with a text message from Officer Martinez. Chief, wanted you to know that Mrs. Fleming's grandson just submitted his application to the police academy. He says he wants to be the kind of officer who makes his community proud. Zara smiled and showed the message to Elena. See, Elena said, that's how you know the change is real. When the kids who were afraid of us a year ago now want to join us. As they walked back toward headquarters, Zara thought about the long journey that had brought them to this point. It had started with an 8-year-old girl watching her mother be mistreated by a police officer. It had continued through military service, patrol work, detective investigations, and command training. It had crystallized on courthouse steps when prejudice and accountability had collided in full public view. But it would continue tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day as long as she wore the badge. Because accountability wasn't something you achieved once and then maintained automatically. It was something you chose, every day with every decision, every interaction, every moment when power met responsibility. And in Phoenix, Arizona, they were making that choice every single day. The transformation was complete, but the work was never finished. And that, Zara realized as she walked through the downtown streets where her officers now served with pride and professionalism, was exactly as it should be. Justice wasn't a destination, it was a journey, and every step mattered. 1 year after the courthouse steps incident, the Phoenix Police Department had become a national model for police reform and community engagement. Officer Coleman served 18 months in federal prison and was permanently barred from law enforcement. Chief Zara Mitchell was named Police Chief of the Year by the International Association of Chiefs of Police and went on to advise departments across the country on implementing accountability measures. But the real measure of success wasn't in awards or recognition. It was in the daily interactions between police officers and community members, interactions characterized by mutual respect, professional conduct, and the understanding that public safety is a shared responsibility. The courthouse steps where it all began now serve as a reminder that accountability and justice aren't just ideals to aspire to. They're standards to uphold every day, one interaction at a time. Because in the end, that's how change really happens. Not in grand gestures or dramatic moments, but in the accumulation of countless individual choices to do what's right. Even when no one is watching, especially when no one is watching.